Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing crushing of France, I guess you could say, and the Low Countries. Don't want to leave them out. So we're doing that. We're going to continue here. Oh, let me just pause this for a moment. Had a good request, and I think I'll try to remember to do it as we get new models in. It was to go through some of the aircraft types and tank types and talk a little bit about them, and we could do that here. Okay. This is the Panzer III Aus G. It had the 37mm gun. Okay. Just a basic thing. The Panzer I, very much so, but also the Panzer II were never intended as a tank for war. The Panzer Is were obviously sent to serve in the Spanish Civil War, but it was looked at by the Panzer Corps, the Wehrmacht, or the Heers, or the Army, whatever you want to say, as purely a training tank. The very earliest sort of models were entirely open top thingies that you just drove around for just driving school, shall we say, purposes. But to figure out, and not, when I say training tank, not so much to, it did have the purpose, but not so much to train drivers and train gunners, but just to train the army and to develop the whole, how do you do tank warfare, to figure the whole thing out. How do you control, how is it best to control the tanks? Do you control the tanks from a tank, or do you control it from a command vehicle of, like an armored car or half-track thing? How do you command them? How to get them to operate with each other? That's what I'm talking about, a training tank. I mean, yes, as well, drivers and gunners and that kind of thing. But it was really, the Panzer I and the Panzer II were really very much thought of as training vehicles. For military purposes, there were to be two basic tanks, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. The Panzer III was to be the main battle tank. Guderian wanted it to have a 50mm gun. The turret ring, the thing that which the turret sort of sits in, was large enough for a turret to be able to have a 50mm gun, but there was, I think, a combination of no immediately available in production 50mm gun, and when they looked around at most of the other tank types, particularly Polish and Czech tank types, and I think also British ones, they thought the 37mm was plenty of gun to deal with it. The one tank country that generally had heavier armor that the 37mm had some difficulty was France. Its even light tanks had fairly thickish armor. Not that the 37 wouldn't go through it, but and the French were using a 37mm gun, but generally a very low-powered, low-pressure 37mm gun. Obviously, the British had one tank type, the Matilda II, that was basically invulnerable to a 37mm gun. You could track the tank, but you couldn't really disable it with the 37mm gun. And the French had the Char B, that was more or less invulnerable to a 37mm anti-tank gun, but particularly the anti-tank guns, the towed anti-tank guns, they learned on the Char B that on sort of the side, rear half of the side of the tank, there were, on each side, there were about a 18-inch square ventilation panels you could readily identify even with camouflaging. And if you shot there, you shot the engine and took the engine out. So it was, it was just literally a ventilation. Now, that may have been armor-like enough to stop a regular machine gun bullet, but didn't really do anything significant to stop an anti-tank round, and I'm not even sure if it was armored at all. But so they just had to hit that one spot, and then they could take out the Char B. Otherwise, the Char B and the Matilda II were invulnerable to the Germans' basic anti-tank gun, which was the 37mm towed, the PaK-36, and invulnerable to the 37mm anti-tank gun, and basically to largely invulnerable to the Panzer IV's 75mm gun, because it was a low pressure. That was the other tank type, which was the Panzer IV, which was looked at as a support tank. Not really an infantry tank like sort of the French and the British understood an infantry tank. It was more of a put out a high explosive round to blow up bunkers and similar sorts of large objects that you would want to be able to do that. And the 37mm just wouldn't blow them up very well. And it was not a super low pressure, but it was a lowish pressure gun. It was a an L24, where if you think of the long-barreled 75s, they were generally speaking in L48, which gives you the amount of pressure differences, you know, getting about double, or well, size of the cartridge behind it, not really the actual pressure differences, but that the really weak, small, it's similar to the French tank guns. The Germans had and I wish I had a good slideshow I could show you here, an infantry gun, 75mm. It was the L12, and that's don't know what the lightest pictures here. No, not that. Not even that. That's already gone way past the L12. But that's a 150mm infantry gun, not a proper artillery piece. But so getting off the tank topic. So the Panzer IV was a with its low velocity gun, was actually a very poor tank killer. The 37mm was a better tank killer, at least at the time. They later had a different round that they would, a heat type round that we could get into, a high explosive anti-tank, a shape charge that they made the L24, the 75mm L24 gun, to actually start knocking out tanks well. So this is a Panzer II here. Really was not meant for maybe reconnaissance, but that's just a maybe and a sort of an afterthought. They were set up as a, like I was saying, training vehicles. So Germany did not plan to start the war in 39. They planned to have a war against Poland in the end of 39, but not the big war against France and Britain. So they had the wrong equipment at the start. So that's, and we can go down here. The armor attachment still, you know, this is and I'm not right offhand on, I have to look it up, the exact numbers. You get into the later the 50mm. Now the heavy armor here, now this is the pre-production model of the Tiger, what becomes the Tiger tank, the VK something 4 and 5, I think 004 and 5. The earlier heavy armor, and Germany did have some early heavy armor. They were multi-turreted affairs, and I think if we looked at this earlier, we would see some of them. That they had a turret. They were made by a couple of, two different companies. I have to look that up. One of them had in the turret both types. I think it's two companies, but both of them had dual guns in their turret. One was the 37mm, and one was the 75, the L24. In one model they were side by side. The other model, one was above and below each other, which made the turret even taller. And this was done because Partially, I think the 37 millimeter shell was smaller, so you could carry more of them, and an acknowledgement that the 37 millimeter was, generally speaking, a better anti-tank gun than the 75 millimeter, but it was to be a big, heavy tank to assault, the Maginot line and that kind of thing. It did not have heavy armor on it because the perception at the time was, if you look at the Polish tanks, the sort of tankette without the turret, it was armed with a 20 millimeter gun like the Panzer II, though obviously didn't have a turret, but it was a hull-mounted 20 millimeter tank killing weapon. Just coming out the VP7 Polish tank had the 37 millimeter gun. The Czech 35T and the 38T, which really the 38T was just coming out as Czechoslovakia was falling apart and kept in production by the Germans. But those were armed with a 37 millimeter gun. The French's 37 millimeter guns were very low pressure. They did have the 47 millimeter on the Salma S35, and then the Char B, which had the hull-mounted 75 millimeter gun, which was a higher pressure 75 millimeter gun than the L25. So, but most of the tank that they were preparing to fire, and also all the Soviet, like the T-26, some of those just had machine guns, or they had weapons in the 35 millimeter type and 37 millimeter type range mostly, and the very famous BT series, BT5s and BT7s, were all in the 35, 37 millimeter type range for their main gun. So they didn't have the idea, Germany, for the heavy tank to have like Tiger-like heavy armor. It was to be sort of standard thickness armor with two guns in the turret, plus two auxiliary turrets that were Panzer I turrets mounted, one sort of front right and the other one rear left, to give between the two complete firing arcs in auxiliary turrets with, there are two machine guns in each turret of the Panzer I. And so it was a big multi-crew affair. So, between the turret, there are probably like 7 or 8, I'd have to look it up, but 7 or 8 people in each of these tanks. And they built, somewhere between 3 and 9. It depends what source and if they're being specific to one model or the other. But they built just a few of these big, heavy monstrosities that weren't overly useful. So that's currently what is being used. Let's see the infantry tank, and here it is. This is the new model. It's new NB whatever. And it is called the Panzer 6, but it just new model, and these sort of died. And you can see here the Panzer I turret here. I think this is the one with the parallel main guns on it. Basically, these were sent to Norway, and I don't know really what happened to them after they went to Norway. And they were used as a some sort of panzer company up there for occupation duties and propaganda duties. Is filmed, photographed a lot up in Norway as part of the force up there. I have no idea if they were, I've never seen a late war picture like with camouflage or late war markings on them, or anybody with late war uniforms. They're all wearing the early black with the Panzer berets. So type. And like I say, this is a SP gun. It's the 150 millimeter infantry gun, which is different than an artillery piece. I don't know how many calibers in length of the cartridge, but it was a very low velocity 150 millimeter gun. And basically 105 millimeter gun for proper artillery has a much bigger impact than these shorter range weapons have. But this is mounted on a Panzer I hull. That's an overly heavy pack artillery system that he used there. If I'm not mistaken, that's a mid to late war 105 millimeter gun. Now, Germany's answer to the infantry tank was von Manstein's design concept. Not that he got out and mechanically designed the thing, but he set up the parameters for it, which was the Sturmgeschütz, the Stug 3, and it's called the Stug 3 because it's based on the Panzer III hull, and it has the L-24 low pressure at this time 75 millimeter gun, and it was very much designed as a fortress fighter type weapon, in that whether, if you will, fortresses is in a proper Maginot Line type fortress, or if it was simply a fortified building that, you know, the infantry showed up 3 days earlier and used sandbags and turned it into a, you know, a fort, if you will. And obviously in Europe at this time there's lots of brick and very thick stone masonry of multiple feet thick. That, you know, buildings to use to make as fortresses that you then, you know, barricade up the windows and have machine guns sticking out of them. If you were to roll up a you know, a Panzer II or a even a 37 millimeter gun, eventually you could sort of blow your way through it. But if they had an anti-tank gun, or they could bring up anti-tank guns available, or even anti-tank rifles in the early stages, they could take your tank out. What they wanted to do with this model was reinforce the front armor, because that's what you were going to show the enemy, and roll up onto it and shoot it with your 75 millimeter gun, which would blow it apart. And it was kept to a very low profile, so that there was less area that you would need to armor up, because you didn't have a turret. It was cheaper to build, because you're building a turret and all the elements to it cost, if not maybe so much money, if you will, but as in time, in production time. So it's much cheaper to build the Stug 3. And so low profile, armor concentrated in the front, and, you know, a good enough good enough explosive projector out there to project out an explosive shell. And it was meant to be used when and where you had the enemy identified. So it wasn't, you know, it was meant to come up, you know, the whole front is filled with infantry troops spread out everywhere, so you would, you know, rapidly know. And obviously if enemy tanks or surprises showed up, field telephones or radios would let command elements know of any potential danger. But otherwise, you know where the danger is, you roll up onto the whatever the appropriate range is, depending on the target type and terrain and all that features into it, but with face towards the danger, and you start blowing up pockets of resistance, if you will, in a fortified sense. So they very much felt that they, you know, not that it didn't have side armor, it did, because, you know, you can never be 100% right up straight to every threat, but it was concentrated in front, and it did its job very well. It did its job so well that, including the cheap production capabilities, and since it was mounting on a Panzer III hull, once the 50 millimeter guns were determined to be too weak, and they had started mounting the 75 millimeter, the L-24, the short-barreled, into the Panzer III at the sort of end of its life, once they had the heat round that would penetrate armor. They were realizing that even with that, it would, the heat round would take out a T-34, which is sort of the thing that the Germans felt they needed to be able to take out. You could take out even the late model T-34-85 with the L-24 gun with the heat round, but you had to get in fairly close, and there's no point of having tanks have to get in fairly close on the Russian steppes. So it was getting to where it was, and you couldn't easily readily with the turret ring size mount in a longer barreled gun, because you had more of the gun sticks inside of the turret, and you have to handle the longer shells in the turret, so it really couldn't mount in a practical sense the 75 millimeter gun. But they could make these very cheaply and mount that long-barreled 75 millimeter gun and do it effectively. The thing that you'll notice on the sort of mid-later war, once they went to the longer barrel, and we can talk about this more then, is that they felt, or they realized they had to mount an auxiliary machine gun on top because it was being used as a substitute tank. A lot of Panzer Grenadier divisions use these as substitute tanks. Panzer divisions, by the beginning of the Soviet Barbarossa operation, had gone from... Guderian designed the Panzer division. I hope I'm not boring everybody too much with all this, but designed the Panzer divisions to have 4 Panzer battalions. Well, they needed more Panzer divisions for the Barbarossa operation, so they took half the battalions away from every Panzer division, except for maybe like Liebstandart, which was just a regiment, and Das Reich, but which were getting more units attached to it. But all the army ones, they took half the Panzer battalions away to form other Panzer divisions. Well, as the war went on, often within the Panzer divisions, they weren't getting enough replacements, and even with the 2 battalions, often the 2nd battalion became a battalion of Sturmgeschütz, because they just didn't have enough tanks, and they were cheaper to build, and so they were able to significantly extend the life for production of the Panzer III using the Sturmgeschütz 3. So this sort of lets you know that Germany really was very adaptable in its tank models, and they did, in my opinion, an excellent job in adapting and developing its tank models. The downside is doing all this adapting slowed up and disrupted production, because once they would figure something out, they would request the changes, and even stuff that isn't made in, Aus C/D version or something, that this is there were even minor variations within, say, the Aus C that no one really records, but if you look at the production details, and they would even take tanks completed sitting at the factory and go, oh, well, let's wheel all these tanks back into the factory and make the changes. So, because they were trying to make the best product they could for the German soldier to be in, but what it did was disrupt, because to take those tanks back into the factory, you have to put what's already, 3/4 of the way or whatever stage being produced. They have to pause that production to take the 20 or 30 tanks sitting in the yard outside the factory getting ready to be shipped back in there to do whatever changes to meet the newest standards before they send them off to the front. So they were constantly interrupting production. And this is something that, from the game purposes, and particularly up to right now and historically, German army, and very much so before the war, would do things like, we want 30 of this model Panzer II. And Krupp or whoever would go, oh, great, yeah, we can, and we want those in 3 months. Oh, great. And they would, sign the contract and start producing them. Krupp is happy because it has its factory operating at enough of a level to keep everybody at that factory employed. They're going to sell, make a profit on the tank, so they're happy with that stuff. But this wasn't even, at a 5-day work week, 8-hour work schedule, putting that factory into full production. They could have, say, instead of 30 tanks in those 3 months, they could have built 300 tanks. They just said, we want this model, keep building it until we tell you it changes. They were building to order, and so that they weren't nearly the production levels that they could have achieved. And yes, they were training tanks. Yes, Germany was still trying to work out the details of what it wanted a Panzer III to be. Figuring out, we need a new change in the transmission, or we need a new vision block here, or whatever it was as they were working with it. But they could have readily, before the war, put greater production particularly tanks. And I know a lot more about tanks, as you can maybe tell, than, say, the story of aircraft. I know some of the elements there too, but so it makes it sort of hard for a game designer like Paradox to reverse engineer things. When we switch some of these like war, economic laws, as they call them here, I agree with that, because that's going from, say, an 8-hour work day to 2 10-hour work days, or 2 12-hour work days, or 3 8-hour work days, in that, in 2 or 3 shifts, getting a lot more out of that factory and that sort of production, with a lot more, obviously labor coming in to do that. So some of this can reasonably be shown with these laws. So I very much, as a game design option, agree with these. But they really don't show what, when how many ICs is should be here if there was a tank factory here in Hanover, versus is there a rifle factory, and is there an aircraft engine factory, or you name it, factory, how many ICs should Hanover have? And then, so it's, really hard to sort of model some of that. And so they've sort of tried to figure out what it took to build up the theoretical German army, and decided that's how many ICs that they should have. But that really doesn't take into account, when I've looked into some of the books, some of the production figures, and because I very much said to this moment, they did not go over to full bore production of any of these major models. I'm talking tanks, is what I know at this point. When they achieved the victory over France, they actually slowed tank production. Didn't actually halt it, but slowed it, because, hey, the war was over. We have defeated the French, because they saw that as the war, sort of, Britain looked at that as the Battle of France was lost, yes, but the war wasn't lost. But the Germans thought the war was over. They'd done what they couldn't have done in World War I. They were still theoretically at war with Britain, and I say theoretically because obviously there were submarines out operating, there were air battles going on with Britain and all of that, but they sort of kind of knew that the army that left Dunkirk had abandoned most of its equipment, and they had a mildly good, I don't know if anybody really knows how, because they burnt a lot of the records, really how badly the British were equipped, but they couldn't hide all of the emergency weapons that they were bringing in from America. And another thing that I have been in my life is a firearms collector, and there's what's known as red stripe weapons. And those were weapons that were sent to the British that were made in America with American calibers. The P14, the P17, they were a type of Enfield rifle, not the classic SMLE type Enfield that you think of. But they were another Enfield type rifle that was sort of an alternative British rifle for World War I. Canada used a lot of them. That America started to produce for Britain during World War I as a this is before America got into the war, as a profit-making enterprise, that Britain needed more rifles. I forget the company, and maybe even Winchester, but I sort of forget the company. Just guessing there. Started producing these rifles for the British to equip Britain's armies fighting in World War I, to help, make money, help the British out because they couldn't make enough weapons. Well, once America entered that war, America didn't have, in World War I, didn't have nearly enough rifles to equip the army that they were planning on sending over there. And so they needed rifles badly. Well, they started to make these rifles in the American 30-06 caliber because they were fine rifles. They're not, in my opinion, as good as the SMLE type Enfield rifle or as good as the 1903 Springfields, but they were a more than serviceable 5-shot bolt-action rifle. And for training purposes and for equipping purposes of the American Expeditionary Force, though I don't know how many of them actually got sent over to France, they built a bunch of these rifles in the 30-06 for American purposes. Well, Britain was desperate after and they couldn't hide all this from, this was when America was at peace, and there were obviously openly operating German agents and embassy staff members observing what was going on, that they were shipping these weapons. Britain was buying everything they could to get and shipping them to Britain. And so when they got to Britain, because they were the same type of rifle that the British already had and produced in Britain, as well as had American production of them from World War I, they stopped. By the time America got in the war, they stopped making them for Britain and were only making them for the U.S. and U.S. caliber. And so to differentiate them from the 303 caliber ones, they at the stock and twice up on the barrel, they put painted big red stripes around them so that it was very apparent that they used different ammunition than the British weapons. But this continued on into late war when Britain was equipping some units with the American M1 Garand, which was only made in the 30-06, but still they red striped them. But Germany was sort of aware that Britain was so desperately short of weapons, and they were importing stuff sort of as an emergency import from America, that, get back to the point, is the low production figures, is they knew that the army that was sitting over here ready to invade, like Napoleon's, if it could get across the channel, it was going to readily and rapidly defeat the British professional army, whether Britain would have been able to go into a guerrilla warfare or just a civilian militia home guard up and desperately fight the Germans successfully or not. That's another question, but the professional army was going to be defeated. So the Germans sort of knew this. They didn't necessarily talk to Hitler, but the German production elements sort of knew that the war was over. Yeah, the Italians were fighting in North Africa, and however many once this is in late 1940. Realize Barbarossa was scheduled early 40, spring 41. And that was very much a secret to a lot of people that they were really planning on doing this. And so a lot of the production officials, now by 41, so from like August 40 to the beginning of 41 is what I'm talking about specifically, is they cut back on a lot of production, maybe not so much aircraft because of the Battle of Britain going on, but from tank production particularly, they cut back because they thought the war was mostly over. And not that Germany wasn't going to maybe fight another war with the Soviet Union or whatever. They were sort of, we can get rid of all these old Panzer IIs and let's figure out figure out the new models that we're going to need and put those into production. So they really thought the sort of production that they were doing didn't need to happen, and they were going to upgrade the turret, the gun on the Panzer III to the 50 millimeter, but that hadn't, the gun hadn't been worked out. I'm sorry if this is all taking too long away from the action, but hadn't worked out the details of all that stuff, so they just slowed production down. Didn't quite stop production on most of the tank models, but they slowed it down. So when somebody's looking back at how many ICs do we need to have to make X number of Panzer brigades, is deceptive. And this is also the sort of, get into sort of the final element of this, is the deceptive miracle of Speer. I read Inside the Third Reich. It's a very good book if you want to know about the inner workings of the Third Reich. I highly recommend it. I think a lot of what is in it is true, but I think Speer overplays. You can have a true thing, but then you can play it up to make Speer sound better within it, if you know what I mean. It's not that it's a lie, it's just sort of make him look good within the realities of the situation. Obviously, it also underplays his knowledge of slave labor and those kind of things. It does that as well. But for if you want to look at it as sort of the inner workings, and that's where I've learned a lot of my, the inner workings of the power game within the Nazi National Socialist regime. It's a very good book for that. But the sort of the miracle of Speer is some elements of his ability to organize projects. That is true. But it was also as much with going from a war economy to total mobilization, in the sense of not just of streamlining projects, but just turning on the factory and saying, produce. Not, we ordered 1,000 machine guns this month, you better produce that 1,000 machine guns. You just start producing machine guns, you produce as many as you can. Whether that's 1,000 or whether that's 1,200 or whether that's 3,000 for a particular factory, you just start it up and you produce. You put on as many shifts of workers as you can, practically get trained and operating and keeping it going. And even with, in some ways, and we can get into some of that, the inefficiencies of German production methods compared to the American production methods, say, in particular the American production methods, they were still doing their inefficiency elements, but they were set up more to just turn on and produce instead of produce to a particular production schedule that they had to fulfill. So that is sort of the big change is with Speer's miracle. And so that all comes into how many factories should Germany have, ICs, and now it's being changed and corrected to some degree for Hearts of Iron 4, that they will have several factory types: civilian, military, and shipyards. I've already asked and had it confirmed. You cannot make other factory types. It's hard-coded. They tried, and I believe Podcat when he says they tried. But they're hard-coded in. Because I wanted particularly, I thought would have been very good, would have been aircraft factories differentiated from other types, and then going potentially over to the full black ice, as the term is now being used. It's set up like artillery factories and tank factories and other specific types of factories, and that may be too detailed for most players, but still aircraft factories would have been the one I would have added for sure. But you can't. So, as you know, sort of specialization like that. So that's a change. Okay, now we're getting back to the war. Oh, good. We just slaughtered a bunch of British submarines right up. Oh, off here. Okay. That is great. So our small boat warfare, and we don't get notified so much as when the aircraft, though I'm sure they helped spotted and took them out, sinks the submarine. So we're doing that. We're doing our job in taking out some of the youth. Oh, they're trying to break out of their pocket. Okay. He's a despicable person. Obviously head of the Totenkopf, guy who set up the... At first they were concentration camps. Not that concentration camps are a good thing, but they weren't yet death camps. They weren't yet designed to kill the inmates, either by working them to death or by no, I don't want to see. I don't want those guys going into there. Or by some other, gas chambers or other means. They were just at first just meant to hold various undesirable peoples. People did die in them, though. Don't mistake that they were. People didn't die in the death camp or the concentration camps, but they weren't yet designed to be death camps yet. It wasn't until around 41, I think that the... Man, I'm not great on dates, I'm sorry. 41 or so that they were really starting the final solution with the death camps. And that was partly because of the difficulties that they were already having in killing the Jews, particularly in Poland, in sort of roving death squads. They figured they needed to be able to do it in camps. No, let's send him to Calais and take on that. Okay, so now... This Polizei, I don't know if I talked about this in this series yet. Polizei Division. Himmler was in charge of the police in Germany. We gotten the Himmler event yet? I don't think we have. We should have by now. I think. But which I'm going to attach all the police units to Himmler once they happen. And he wanted to, as the war was getting started, he wanted to expand his empire. And so he created the Polizei Division, which was made up of policemen, but mostly policemen with at least basic military background. You know, they'd been in the army for some time, at some point before him. At this point, it was definitely not an SS division. It was Polizei. But although I agree because they were trained policemen, they should have police skills, but having it as a military police regiment is wrong. These 3 regiments, they were full-sized and equipped for as a regular infantry unit. So that should be a regular brigade with maybe an auxiliary or another sort of Polizei Schützen regiment, call it the 3rd or whatever, and make that as police for anti-occupation. But they were a proper army type division in that sense, with maybe not great training levels at the divisional level, if you know what I mean, by lots of exercises and other training to do it, but as individual skill sets for soldiers, they were proper soldiers in that thing. They weren't just regular policemen without any training given military weapons. They were trained soldiers. And it was later brought into it as an SS division. Proper, if you will, or whatever you want to say. We're not going down the road of peace with Yugoslavia in any format. Someday, probably more like in the time for Hearts of Iron 4, I want to script in a series of events dealing with Yugoslavia. And so that it's not any sort of guarantee that it, you know, betrays the Axis and joins the Allies like it did with the coup inside. Make that as a, you know, most likely historical outcome, but make it possible so that if you got Yugoslavia in the Axis, it would stay there, but not maybe likely, but possible. Okay. Active sonar. That's good. How are we doing with... Okay, we're already in the red, so we'll just leave that. Okay, well, I know I talked a lot, so we didn't get as much of the invasion done as we might like, but we will be continuing that. We can quickly take a look and see what's going on over in China. They're still messing around with the Ma out here, because I understand that Ma or family or whatever this sort of group is sort of known as. If we have any China experts, I wouldn't mind a correction on it, but GB Xuanbi, I don't know, San, something like whatever family or whatever, the sort of a group of warlords. They're not obviously about ready. Well, I don't know if they're ready to take it or not, but this is actually sort of good for us in Japan in that if they take it, they will no longer be at war, so they have to change some of their laws for optimum use. Okay, thanks a lot for viewing. I think maybe next time we'll cover some of the aircraft models of currently used, and hopefully I won't talk too much for that. Thanks a lot. Again, thank you for liking the videos and posting comments. Would love to hear your comments. And if you have questions about tanks or other things that I've been talking about, I wouldn't mind clarifying them or giving more details if that would be helpful.